The research with students with developmental disabilities and visual impairments is extremely limited. There's a lot of research on autism spectrum disorders, ASD, and other developmental disabilities. There's a lot. There's not a lot with visual impairment. We refer to a low incidence population. This is a low incidence population. Research is extremely limited. The communication interventions are few. When I talk about communication interventions, well, for this population, for developmental disabilities, ASD, and VI, communication is not a lot there. There's a lot of other interventions comparing different types of communications, different augmentative communication, AACs, with each other, but not with this population. Now, I'm a special education teacher and I'm also a board certified behavior analyst. Now, when I'm approached about questions or working with someone who has disabilities, the first question, one of the first questions, not the first question, is I say, well, how do they communicate their wants and needs? How do they get what they want? How do they get what they want? And unfortunately, when we're talking about this low incidence population, ASD and VI, stakeholders, and when I say stakeholders, I mean family, friends, teachers. I said, well, how do they get what they want? If they have an answer, it's usually, well, I know what she wants. I know what he wants. They anticipate their needs. Unfortunately, that is not generalizable to the rest of the public. Eventually, these children, students, adults are going to be around people who don't know them and can't anticipate their needs. So when people say, oh, I know what they want, I can see what she wants. It's not generalizable and it's not sustainable. The other method about how do they figure out what they want for their communicate with their wants and needs, what stakeholders sometimes do is they just start throwing reinforcers at them. When I say reinforcers, I'm saying something that they'll engage in, excuse me, to get something that keeps the behavior going. And if there's a tantrum, if they're acting out, people oftentimes just start throwing potential reinforcers at them, hoping to appease them. If it does, we're not even sure which they were working for, which they wanted, or what made them stop. So how can they communicate their wants and needs? That's a big question. That's a big question. And the last bullet on this, now, I mean, kindergarten through 12th grade, while they're teachers, while they're training in education, is usually adequate for the majority of student population. This is a low incidence, multiple disabilities, multiple low incidence disabilities. And working with them would be borderline special education teacher, speech pathologist, and board certified behavior analyst. So the participants that I worked with, there were 4 students in a specialized public school in Philadelphia. Now, this specialized public school was primarily for students with visual impairment. For the blind is in their title of their school. But students with visual impairment and other disabilities. If the students just had a visual impairment, they likely would have been included in general education in Philadelphia or the Philadelphia area. But these kids, all the students there have visual impairment with some other disabilities. Now, some of those disabilities include ASD. Now, of the 4 students, 2 were 3 years old and 2 were 4 years old. There were 3 girls and 1 boy. And what's important is that they displayed no functional communication. Their stakeholders just didn't know what they wanted. They had no functional communication. Now, there were other, part of the criteria, part of the screening criteria for the participants was that they had no functional communication. You know, if they weren't able to communicate their wants and needs regularly and independently, then they weren't options. They weren't candidates for this study. No functional communication. So as far as what type of experimental design, I used an alternating treatment design with a final best treatment only option at the end. Basically, I did a baseline. Baseline is I just collected data on their independent responding. The target behavior was independent responding, actually percentage of independent responses. So with baseline, then we had two independent variables. Okay, the picture exchange communication system, or PECS, very, very popular. And then we had a speech generating device called Sounding Board. It's an app. It was on the iPad. And I'll talk about both of these and how we use them. But with the alternating treatment design, we had the baseline, we had the two independent variables implemented, and then based on the responding, one was identified for the best treatment option at the end. So with PECS, PECS is very, very, very popular, picture exchange communication system. Now, the picture on the left, if you haven't seen a PECS book, okay, PECS books are typically, they're in a book, they're in a binder, and they're Velcro. Their icons are customizable, but you identify reinforcers, things that the person wants to work for, wants to communicate. And they put them in the PECS book. We start off with one at a time, but it is Velcro. So PEC, Picture Exchange Communication System, where they identify the reinforcer in the form of an icon, take it off and hand it to a person, and then that person presents that icon, that reinforcer. Now, with PECS, PECS formally has six phases. The initial phase was how to communicate, teaching them how to go in the book, take the icon, and pull it off. Phase two is something called distance and persistence, where they remove, the PECS book is put farther away. And so of the 6 phases, stage 3 would be teaching discrimination training. All the way up to phase 6 would be commenting. Now, for the purposes of our study, our participants had multiple disabilities. Physical disabilities was part of it as well. Okay, they were all in wheelchairs, so we had to decide which stages to use, which ones would be most practical. So for our study, we implemented phase 1, how to communicate. That was going to book, taking the icon, removing it, and handing it. And phase 3, which was picture discrimination. Now in phase 3, there were a couple different sub-phases. We chose teaching basic discrimination. Now with PECS, with the PECS book, and this is going to be similar with the Sounding Board, with the PECS book, we used one reinforcer. Okay, we identified one thing that the kids liked. We used, and we made an icon of it. And that was for stage 1. When we did picture discrimination, we used a distractor. I'm not going to go into discrimination training, but basically you have 2 options. Okay, you have 2 options. One's something you really like, and then there's something you don't really like. It's not aversive, but it's not what you want. And all the kids, they were not keen on getting messy. So the distractor was a messy icon. And if they chose that during the later discrimination training stage, then they got their hands a little bit messy. Okay. So we skipped, we identified the how to communicate and the picture discrimination. Okay. Now, what's important about this, what's unique to this study, okay, these students, these participants had visual impairments. So what was done is we had they could see a little bit. They could see a little bit. Okay, through my research, people who are have visual impairment, most of them can see a little bit. So what we did was with the PEX icons, we put a tactile on there. So we put a tactile on all the icons so they were different. Okay, this was to address their visual impairments. Now the sounding board, okay, the speech writing device, the SGD, with a sounding board on the iPad, that was our other independent variable. Why do we choose sounding board? It's free for the most part. When you start getting more and more icons, there's a fee, but it was free, it was customizable, and it was very similar to PEX with a couple key differences. I didn't want to identify something black versus white that was too different. I wanted something where I could control, or I can identify the difference in the variables. So sounding board was similar to PEX, and it was easily usable. Now, like PEX, we had tactile reinforcers on the icon, and on stage 2, we had the reinforcer and we had the distractor. We would initiate all the trials with vocally telling them that the reinforcer was in front of them, and then asking, "What do you want? What do you want?" So here are our results. Stage one was how to communicate. We're teaching them how to communicate, and they had both independent variables available. Stage 2 was the best option, and was also discrimination training. So the results, if you can look at our results now, the y-axis, the target behavior, that's percentage of independent responding. iPad is the sounding board, okay, the SGD that we used. Now, if you look at our results, sounding board had more rapid independent responding, okay, definitely had more rapid independent, but why? Okay, but why? Well, I mean, I'll talk about that with the discussion. What I do want to talk about on this slide is that if you notice, there's different numbers of trials before we move on to the next stage. Okay, there's different levels of mastery criteria. For Sally, there's 4 consecutive trials. Okay, Marjorie has 3, Mark has 2, Georgiana has 4. Okay, mastery criteria varied in implementation for a couple reasons. The biggest one were the children were absent a lot, and decisions were made to move on to the next stage regardless of the number of trials that they had completed consecutively. Why was that done? Well, I mean, there's ethical questions of sticking to a predetermined script and withholding the best treatment. You know, whereas Mark had 2 trials, and if I had waited for 4, who knows how long that would have taken, and we would be withholding that best treatment. So also, the participants were not permitted to access either of the interventions outside the classroom. They was only in the classroom during the time of the study. So it may have been useful to them. I mean, this was the only time that I was aware of that they were actively requesting what they wanted. So it may be useful to them, but waiting to see which one is going to work best for my purposes may not have been ethical. So that's why a decision was made to move on to the next stage. Now, if you look at stage 2 during discrimination training, all the participants' independent responding dropped. Now, it's not uncommon for participants being trained in augmentative communication using icons to have an initial difficulty selecting an icon when two are available. So in other words, during discrimination training, you're probably going to see a drop in independent responding if you're using icons. Research suggests that. So you look at this, sounding board suggests, or there's more independent, there's a more rapid responding. Why? Well, before we discuss potential barriers or barriers between PECS and the SGD, the sounding board app, the difference in acquisition could be familiarity. While no independent iPad applications were used prior to this study, it's highly likely that electronic viewing screens were present in the home. Whether they were TVs, iPads, tablets, computers, phones, etc., it's highly likely that the participants saw the electronic screens as opposed to an iPad. So maybe it's familiarity. They were used to it. One study that I came across stated that parents of children who have ASD used iPads 4.6 out of 5 days. So it's highly likely that they saw screens. So could that have influenced the more rapid responding with the iPad, the sounding board app? Possibly. Now, PECS requires a physical interaction. The E in PECS is an exchange. While the iPad, the sounding board, there was no exchange. Okay? Whereas the PECS, they took it off and handed it. The iPad, in the iPad app, they pressed it and it voiced it. It voiced the reinforcer. There was no physical exchange necessary. So PECS does require physical interaction. Did that bias the participants responding? Possibly. There are definitely more tasks required in PECS. In PECS, in our PECS intervention, our modified PECS, adapted PECS, the participant touched the icon. Then they felt the tactile. They removed it and then presented it. Okay, that's 4 tasks. With the SGD, the iPad or the sounding board app, they touched it, felt the icon, and then pressed it, and it voiced it. 3 tasks. So, I mean, perhaps it wasn't autism spectrum disorder so much, but a physical disability, because all the participants had physical disabilities that prohibits the fine motor skill of removing the icon. Maybe it was just too hard for them, or maybe the other one was just easier. Now, the SGD, the iPad, the sounding board app, that can be personalized. Now, the PECS icons in both modalities can be individualized, but in the SGD, the iPad, the sounding board, the voice, it's when you touch the icon, there's a voice. Okay, the voice can be personalized. So you can use the voice of the most reinforcing person. You know, someone who was around the person, the participant. So perhaps having that individualization and reinforcing voice made it more likely that they were going to choose that one. The last bullet there that needs to be mentioned when comparing these 2 modalities. Yes, the iPad app, the sounding board was more rapid responding, independent responding. But there are a lot of variables that could have compromised their responding. They were absent a lot. Teachers, different people would be assuming different responsibilities. If you've ever been in a low incidence situation, those teachers, those professionals sometimes have a lot of balls in the air between filling out reports, progress reports, different meetings aside from their instruction.
No, lo que quiero es ojalá que nos llegue plata y así podemos salir de estos casos.
And so there were different variables. I mean, as far as student absences, students with disabilities are almost 1.5 times as likely to be chronically absent than typically developing peers. So I believe that this research should continue, it should be replicated, but be aware that absences are likely going to happen. And there are, before we can say with any certainty that one is better than the other. My study, yeah, there was more rapid responding on the sounding board app, but more research is needed. But what's most important is that research is needed for this population to increase their ability to communicate. Thank you. Anyone have any questions?